Today, I'll show you my favorite lenses that I've ever worked with, and we'll talk a little bit about why I love them so much. It's Hudson. Welcome to this week's video. While you're watching this, I'm wrapping up a workshop in Scotland with an awesome group of people in Rick LePage. We'll be back with stories from that soon, so look out for that. So in the interim, I thought I'd go through some of my favorite lenses that I've ever owned, and I'm fortunate enough to own each and every one of my favorite lenses, I think. And we'll go through them in order of sort of more affordable to more expensive and talk about it. They're not all Nikon. There's one that's not even built to go on Nikon, which you probably won't be surprised to see included in here from Leica. But we'll talk about why I love each of these lenses. We'll look at some images from each, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of my journey with lenses. And I'll bet, like a lot of you, I started shooting primarily with zoom lenses because I thought, well, one lens gets you a whole bunch of focal lengths. It's super versatile. You don't have to spend as much money. And in the days when I was early shooting photography, I was in the military as an enlisted person and then in college, and I didn't have very much money. So I had not very fast zoom lenses, and I did the best I could with those in the film days and then moving into the DSLR days. And as I became more successful, you know, I made a journey through law school and the practice of law that I didn't love, and then photography, and had a bit of a successful career, you know, doing both editorial and commercial work in photography before starting this training business. And I have been fortunate enough to be able to get all of the glass that I love along the way. And along that journey, I've moved from those slower zoom lenses to the best of zoom lenses, the 2.8 trinity of lenses, as I shot with the best of the DSLRs, the D850s, the D810s, and then found myself coming back as ISO got so much better and the Nikon Z cameras came out and were so great in low light, and the new F4 glass was so good, kind of throttling back and using more F4 zoom lenses because you can get a range like 100 to 400. You can get 24 to 120. You get wonderful sun stars out of the 24 to 120. You can carry less glass and cover an even broader range with great quality results, but peppering that in with just unbelievable primes. There's only one zoom lens in this group of my absolute favorite lenses. So we'll dive in. We'll take a look at, you know, which are my favorite lenses, and I'll show you images from each one and talk about why I love each lens. Know that there are links to each of these lenses in the video's full description, or you can always run over to hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. You could click right here to go there. Those links all help me out, and I appreciate your using them. So okay, let's talk about each lens. The first one is the first prime lens that I ever fell in love with. I was on a workshop, and one of my participants, Bob, it was in Michoacan for Dia de Muertos way back, 7 years ago, I think, and he showed up with this 105 1.4, and I had purchased the 85 1.8 F-mount lens because I thought it would be small and light and it was fast and we could use it at night for portraits without being up in people's faces in the graveyards at night in Michoacan. Well, we traded, and I worked with this lens a bit, and that's always dangerous, and I just came to realize how special this big chunk of glass is, and I still love it to this day. You know, I had a 105 2.5 AI back in the days of film that I shot on my FM bodies and loved too. That's a very special lens, but this 105 1.4 AF-S is just monstrously special, and I continue to use it. It's the only lens I regularly use still on the FTZ adapter on my Nikon Z bodies, and it is special. I tried the Plena. It feels like a little bit too long a lens for me at 135. I tried the 85 1.2. It's a little too short a lens for me. Both are magnificent. It's also bigger and heavier than this lens. So I stuck with my 105. I'm happy with it. It may come a time when Nikon builds a 105 like Plena, and then I'm in trouble because I'll probably have to buy it. But this is a lens that I adore. It fits into my favorite 6 lenses I've ever owned or used. All right, so let's look at some images from it. All right, so the 105 1.4, it goes back to the F-mount days, and I would have to say This is the first lens that I really, truly just fell in love with a prime lens. I was in Michoacan for the Day of the Dead, Dia de Muertos workshop, and one of my participants, Bob, brought his 105 1.4 along, and I had an 85 1.8, and you know, the 105 1.4 was heavy. He said, oh, I'll trade you for a little bit, and I was shooting with his, and this is how I always get into trouble on these workshops. You know, I started shooting with it, and I realized you could stand back a little further from your subject, put them a little bit more at ease, and separate the background even that much more. And there was just something special about the way that this lens worked. You know, I stopped down a little bit for this one just to, because when I zoomed in and looked on my D850 screen, it was a little bit out of focus in the second eye more than I wanted. You know, here, but I work with this lens all the time wide open, and the sharpness is just incredible. You know, here we are in Cuba in 2019 when I was there with my family in Havana and just like walking the streets with that 105 on the Nikon Z6. And I found that it worked just fabulously with the FTZ adapter, but the way that it just renders the world and how nice it is to work with in the street, to isolate a subject, be far enough away that you're not intruding in the scene, just nail these scenes. You know right who the subject of this is. It's the driver of that car on the Havana streets. You know, here we are stopped down a little bit to just put more of the old fortress at the harbor in sharp focus with these fishermen sitting there. It's just a lovely lens to work with, and I've used it ever since. It's literally one of my favorites. I keep testing out the new big Z primes that are fast and have amazing out of focus details. But the 105 1.4 keeps drawing me back just because I like the 105 focal range. You know, it may be that they come out with some Plena-like Z105 that finally shakes this out of my hand, but this is the last of the F-mount lenses that I just can't get rid of. I adore it. Here in the owl woods of the Birds of Prey Rehabilitation Center that we photographed during the Charleston workshops, it's a tight area, and working with these birds in flight in the woods, you know, I was always finding the background details in the trees too distracting. So going to 1.4 and shooting these birds there where I can just blow the background to pieces. Here's a portrait, you know, or just, you know, I will always bring that lens with me for this shooting scenario, or for this sort of street shooting where you're not bothering your subjects, you're just able to capture them out in their place, or shoot portraits and show, you know, exactly what the subject of this photograph or that photograph is, just the way that it renders those out of focus details, and how sharp what's in focus is, right down to f1.4. It's a beautiful lens. All right, so I think you can see why I love this lens. It is amongst the two most affordable lenses in this group. You can buy it new still for $2,000, but because there are so many people dumping them, buying the Plena lens and the 85 1.2, you can pick this lens up on eBay. I did a search, and I'm putting the link to eBay. That's not a link that helps me out, but I think it's the best way to get this lens. Putting it in this video's description. I saw them as low as $1,000 looking really nice in the description over on eBay. So if you hunt, you can find a great deal on one of these. The next lens is about $1,000. This is the 1.8 S lens for the Nikon Z system. I bought it looking for a Sunstar lens. I kept it finding the best night lens and Milky Way photography lens, star photography lens, nightscape photography lens that I have ever used. I don't think there's a better one out there, particularly on a star tracker. It's about $1,000, as I said. Probably the cheapest lens in this lineup, certainly the cheapest new lens, and special. Take a look at some images. The 21.8 is a lens that I invariably reach for when I pull out my Move Shoot Move Nomad star tracker and I start photographing the night sky. It's a lens that wide open renders the Milky Way just kind of unbelievably right out to the edge, you know, and I love to do these composited night sky work, shooting the foreground at blue hour, you know, the last light's gone from the landscape, shooting the night sky unobstructed on the star tracker from the same location, and blending those two images. And the way
that the 21.8 renders the night sky wide open at 1.8. You see there's just no coma, no chromatic aberration, right out to the very corners of the frame, and it's razor sharp wide open, which lets me work with 60-second or 90-second images on the star tracker. Lets me work a lot faster, and I am just out there frequently using this lens for the night sky. This was just last week during our Oregon Coast Cannon Beach workshop. It's a lens that I bought thinking it might replace the 21.8 old F-mount lens that I loved the Sunstar from, and this throws a decent Sunstar, but it's nowhere near as nice a Sunstar as the old F-mount lens. I did find a lens that throws a nice Sunstar in the 24 to 120 kind of all-purpose F4 S lens. You stop that down to F11 or F16, it throws a beautiful Sunstar. But this lens becomes a favorite because I love our ability to capture the night sky, and it does it better than any of the other lenses, any other lens that I've ever used. The 21.8 is my night lens.
All right, so next up, not a big surprise to any of you who've been following me for a while, is the 50mm 1.0 manual focus Voigtlander for Nikon Z, the Nokton. This is a special lens. The feel, the precision, the way that it renders the world. You know, I borrowed this lens from B&H to test a bunch of Voigtlanders and wound up having to have it, especially when the Nikon ZF launched. And this lens rarely leaves my ZF, and rarely do I take my camera bag without this combination being along. Let's take a look at some images.
All right, the 51.0. You know, I have been shooting all the Nikon Z glass, and then aftermarket companies started to produce lenses for the Z mount, and Voigtlander came out with a series of lenses, and I got a number of them. B&H loaned them to me. I tested out 4 or 5 different ones. I've got videos about that, but the 51.0 landed in my hand, and just the feel of it and the way that it felt on the camera, and then when I started looking at the images. And I mean, most of these images, you're gonna find I shoot almost everything wide open at f1. You know, here's Stacy the day I was testing the one from B&H up high in Manhattan, just the ability to kind of blow that background out, and just how sharp and wonderful it renders the world at 1.0. It's just, there's a special character, there's a specialness to the way that the world falls off to out of focus with this lens. It does this kind of swirly, interesting character thing. It just has a different look than any other lens. I also own the Nikon 51.8, and I love that lens. It's sharp, it's amazing, but there's just something kind of special about the Voigtlander. Now, obviously a manual focus lens. This is the NYA-EVO guys. I stopped down a bit to F2.8 just to put their eyes in better focus, and it gets so sharp, stopped down just a little bit. You know, it has just an amazing ability to render the world, and I love using it in black and white. It just feels like a vintage lens to me, so flipping into monochrome mode and looking at the world in black and white through my viewfinder, framing it up and shooting it. Here's my good friend Sajal and her son Dylan, my friend Dylan, during our Mazatlan workshop for the Total Eclipse this year. This is my cousin Ben and his daughter Stella in Australia. My good friend Pete with Jim in the background in Costa Rica. Look at the way it renders the scene. It's just crazy, you know. JD at the bar in Costa Rica, you know, a more fitting portrait. My good buddy. I can't wait to see JD again. You know, Corinne in Glacier National Park. I love photographing people with this lens. I love photographing the landscape with this lens, but I love putting people together in their environment and then letting the environment go to a dreamlike state with this. Here's David Archer working in Glacier. Here's Charlie Johnson photographing the shipwreck last week during our workshop. And you know, you can just use it to isolate things. Here's a shot of Brad working with his Plena at the shipwreck, and it just goes to show sort of, you know, here's why the Plena was a rough lens for me. You have to get so far away from what you're photographing. And I think this one just exemplifies what I love about this lens. This was in the on the walkway under the bridge in Astoria over to the Washington side, and just, you know, the way that Amy is so sharp, and, you know, Cliff walking toward her is just a mystery, a dark, disturbing mystery in this noir way that it renders the rest of the world that's falling out of focus. I shoot this lens almost invariably at f1, and I often have a 3-stop ND filter on it during the daylight hours just to make that possible on the ZF.
All right, so I think you can see why I love it. It is a big, hefty chunk of glass. It's about $1,700 new. Sometimes you can find a reasonable deal on them used as well. It's an awfully durable, bomb-proof lens. You won't find anything else. I know $1,700 seems like a lot for a manual focus lens, but it renders the world in a special way. And on a camera like the ZF or the Z6 III with the manual focus subject detection, getting things sharpened in focus is a breeze. All right, so let's move to the only zoom lens in this lineup of favorite lenses, and that is the new 14-24, the 14-24 S lens for Z-mount. It's smaller, it's lighter, it's sharp right to the edges. It's great at every aperture. It renders contrast and color beautifully. When the Z system first launched, the first ultra wide was the 14-30. It's small, it's light, it's affordable. I tested it and it was sharper than the original 14-24 AF-S lens. I thought, wow, this is special. It had 82mm filter mount, which you needed to go a little wider with the filters to avoid vignetting to 95. But then the 14-24 released, and I thought, well, I'll test it. And that was a mistake because I wound up selling the 14-30. This lens is special. It is my favorite zoom lens. It's the only zoom lens that feels incredibly special to me these days. So let's take a look at some images from it.
Okay, so the 14-24 S, you know, I bought this lens immediately when it was released because I loved the old 14-24 F-mount lens so much, the AF-S. And I had started working with the 14-30 F4 S Z lens and found it even sharper than the 14-24 F-mount, but there was always something special about the way that the old 14-24 rendered the world. And I remember this is the night that it arrived. My little girl Pepper was just maybe 3 years old, and she was in the kitchen eating something. The cat's waiting to get out. You know, people were like, leave me alone with that camera. But I just started seeing immediately that there was something special about the way that this camera was capturing the world and about having that F2.8. And then I started noticing how sharp things that were in focus were in the corners, wide open, which is something that the old lens was incapable of. You really had to stop down to get the corners sharp. Wide open, this new lens, like so many of the S-glass lenses, is just sharp right to the corners. And then if you stop to f11, it goes sharp forever. And if you stop down to f16, you don't lose much sharpness to diffraction. It's one of those lenses that's just great at every aperture. And if you're a wide angle junkie, it lets you render the world in a different way. When those cloudscapes are amazing, you can get the foreground and the sky, you know, at the same time. Stop down to f11 and you know you're going to be sharp right to the edge. It just opens up scenes that are spectacular, and it lets you keep things so sharp. And in lower light, you know, or here you go, f11, and just get everything razor sharp, foreground to background in the bristlecone pines. It throws a nice sunstar too. You know, it's not that traditional, finer, less pointed sunstar, but it throws a nice looking sunstar. It's clean. There's very little ghosting or flare shooting into straight point sources. This is a lens that the way that it just renders contrast and color is special, and it lets you work in spaces going just so wide. Here we are at Sand Dune Arch in Moab with one of my favorite compositions for the workshop, you know, portrait of the group shot. Remember this day and the Isle of Skye just saying, stop the van to Rick, and running out and finding a bit of foreground to go with those clouds, you know, and it works night scenes really well too. It is sharp at f2.8, and it is sharp right to the edges. It's a little bigger and it takes a little longer exposure at 2.8 than the 20 millimeter 1.8 does on the tracker, and it's a little, you know, it's just a little bit bigger rig, but it also does fine night sky work, and you know, just the ability to get up close on an interesting foreground and capture scenes like this. This was at Cannon Beach, and we were close in on the tide pools, and yet Haystack Rock was right next to us, and going to, you know, a little wider angle. Well, we're at 21 millimeters here. Being able to work in that range from 14 to 24 to capture the scene that you're after is just wonderful. This is, of course, 3 frames, one about a stop underexposed I found was best, looking at my histograms of all 3 frames, about a stop underexposed, and then bracketing. So 4 stops underexposed, 1 stop underexposed, 2 stops overexposed, bracketing around that 1 stop underexposed frame with 3 stops on either side of it. And then blending that simply in Lightroom into a linear raw file with all that tonal information throughout the image. Lets you just tone it without losing any of the highlight or shadow detail. This lens is special. I love the new 14 to 24, and I'm rarely without it.
All right, so it's a lens I love. It's on sale right now. Normally it's $2,500. It's on sale for $21. I think it's been on sale for $21 for a while. Again, link in this video's description. It's wonderful. I love its little digital readout that shows depth of field and focal distance, and its double function buttons, and it's just lovely. I like using the 112 millimeter case filter system with it, with its hood. Its hood that comes with it also fits all of the 2.8 zoom lenses, so you can use those 112 millimeter filters across your zoom kit. That's actually the last one I'm going to mount on the ZF, and it's the last one. I mean, $2,100 is expensive, but it's the last one in sort of the realm of the sane. We're about to move into sort of insane money for insane quality. And I'll start off with the last Nikon lens, which is the 400 TC. This guy is the best lens I think I've ever shot with. David Archer brought it to, gosh, I don't remember what workshop it was. I think it might have been Costa Rica, the first Costa Rica workshop. I got the 800 PF, David Archer got the 400 TC. We were both excited. We both shot them both. We both loved our lenses, but I realized right then and there that the 400 TC was the best lens I'd ever used. It has the built-in teleconverter. It's extremely hand-holdable. I can carry it around all day by its handle. You pop it up, and boom, you're shooting. You want a little longer shot, you flip the teleconverter, you're at 560 f4 instead of 400 2.8. It takes a 1.4 teleconverter beautifully. It takes a 2.0 teleconverter well if you want. It is the epitome of special. It is insanely expensive at $14,000, but take a look at some images from it.
All right, so the 400 TC S lens for the Z system is undoubtedly the best lens I've ever held, photographed with, or owned. There was a long time where it was the best lens that I had held or photographed with, and then you know, I kept using David Archer's and just feeling jealous and in my heart of hearts wanting one. And then, you know, finally an opportunity came with our good friend Alex was letting go of his, and I know and trust Alex, you know, implicitly. He's a great guy who's been on a couple of workshops with us, and he I talked to my wife and she said you should get it, which tells you why Stacy is the most amazing wife on the planet. And I love working with this lens. It is so sharp, and it renders the world in a special way. Whether you're at 400 millimeters or whether you flip that lever and are at 560 millimeters, like this scene. These are mostly Costa Rica shots. Here's one from Glacier National Park, I think generally untouched from this summer. You know, just it is so sharp, it is so special. The backgrounds are so beautiful, especially when you're down at f2.8 at 400. You know, here's a ground squirrel that was in the little bushes out in front of me. It renders highlights and backlight incredibly well. This is a single frame, not an HDR capture. The coatings on this lens are commensurate with the coatings on all of the other S class, and it doesn't behave like a normal long lens. The ghosting and flare is just suppressed, you know, and it's small enough and light enough that I never use it with a monopod or on a tripod. I hand hold it, and you can even track moving subjects with it. It is obviously a very expensive lens that not everyone can afford, but it has to rate as my favorite big prime lens I've ever held or used, and I feel really fortunate to have it.
All right, last but not least is Leica's Summilux 28 1.7 lens that's on the Leica Q series. This is on my Q3, a 60 megapixel backlit sensor, and this lens is stupendous. It runs from f1.7 to f16, and I haven't found a bad aperture with it. It is also an expensive lens. You can't buy this lens alone. It comes with the camera. It's $6,300 for the Q3. You get the same lens with the Q or the Q2, but these cameras hold their value. The used market stays pretty crazy for these, and once you've shot with it, you realize why. This is another one where my workshop participant Elizabeth in Costa Rica let me use this camera for a day. I brought the images home. I was looking at them and I couldn't believe what I saw. This lens is incredibly special. It makes me hesitate in saying that the 400 TC is the best lens I've ever used, because they're on that kind of par. These two lenses are just insanely special. Let's take a look at some images from it.
All right, so the Leica Summilux 28mm 1.7 lens that comes on all of the Q cameras, the original Q, the Q2, and the Q3, is as amazing as the 400 2.8 TC as a lens. It's small, it's tiny, it's built in to this little camera. You know, you don't get it for cheap, but it's less than half price of the 400 TC, and it comes with a camera, a wonderful 60 megapixel camera attached to it if you get the Q3, and it renders the world in astounding detail at every aperture possible, you know, right from f1.7 to f16, and the lens markings on the barrel are accurate. Infinity is infinity. The depth of field gauge is perfect for doing hyperfocal distance, and it shoots macro too. It's an incredible lens for landscapes, you know, and the level of detail that it renders is just shocking. You know, here we are at f4.5, backed a little ways away from this lighthouse. I think you get the idea. I love setting up and using this in the landscape. Here we are in Moab, or walking up handheld and shooting my friend Philip, surprising him, saying, "Hey Philip." He was like, "Whoa, that was creepy." But you know, we were photographing the full moon with long lenses, and then I just picked up the Q3 on my side and stepped in at f1.7, eighth of a second, because that 28mm is so good, and it has the vibration reduction built in, the image stabilization in body. It's just amazing. Having this on my side when I'm out doing landscape photography to capture people, or setting it up to do landscape photography itself, is just fantastic. You know, here again, another HDR image, 3 stops overexposed, 3 stops underexposed, 1 on the meter blended. Rick shooting on the Isle of Skye at Talisker Bay. Street photography with this lens. It's small, it's light, it's unassuming. You can have it with you everywhere. Here's the streets of Glasgow during a rainstorm. Here's streets of Glasgow at night at f1.7. I mean, you get the idea. This is a lens. My little cousin Stella on Bell's Beach near Torquay in Melbourne, Australia. Rick in Charleston in a fun bar where we were grabbing lunch. You know, we've got Ken and Steve photographing the total eclipse during totality in Mazatlan, just running around handheld, photographing some people. That macro feature in Costa Rica, shooting into backlight, capturing, you know, just how it is at dawn to be out photographing. I mean, just incredible stuff that you're capable of doing with this little machine on your side. It is all because of one incredible lens in that 28mm 1.7.
All right, so there you have it. Those are my 6 favorite lenses and why they're my favorite lenses. If I had to boil it down to my 3 favorite lenses, it would be the Voigtlander, the Summilux, and the 400 TC. Hopefully, Nikon will come out with a 105 Plena and make me challenge that, have a more difficult time deciding, or I might just have to break it down to 4 lenses. Know that I take not an ounce of owning these lenses for granted. You know, it's been a long journey of decades, and this is what I do professionally. So, you know, I value each and every one of these, and I take wonderful care of them, and I adore using them. So they are well loved and well used. And you know, if anybody else has lenses that they think are special and deserve talking about, hit it up in the comments. Let's have a conversation about what everyone's favorite lenses are. I will be back from Scotland relatively soon. It's been a long trip to Europe. I can't wait to share a lot of that content with all of you. And in the meantime, I hope everyone is staying safe and staying creative. And see you next week.